Alright boys, we're borrowing from the Miyazaki handbook today. Spirited Away tells the story of Chihiro, a 10-year-old girl whose family uproots their life to move to the country. In the process of this, Chihiro is whisked away into a spiritual world where she has to work at a bathhouse to rescue her parents. As a part of this journey, we meet many interesting characters, one of which has been synonymous with the film and the subject of this build, Noface. There are many theories what he represents: loneliness, abandonment, but the idea that resonated with me was that Noface gains their identity through consumption, which made me think of a very particular and prominent YouTuber, which I thought this could also apply to. So let's keep beating this dead horse and add another video to YouTube's already saturated Noface craft market. For the base, I started with a piece of 3mm foam and then topped with 10mm balsa wood for the floorboards, before squirting on way too much gloss Mod Podge. Starting with the bath, I used the rounded base of a glass jar and a coffee cup, and laid down some lengths of Sculpt to create two curved lipped edges. Laying down some Vaseline helps first, so with the baking of the clay it doesn't stick to the item. A blade helps me shape the edges, and after lots of poking and prodding with silicone shapers, we end up with two curved, dome-ish shaped things that will eventually turn into the bath. To connect these two parts, I tacked together the edges with some super glue before bonding them together with more clay. The super glue helps hold everything in place while the extra clay fills in any little holes. After this, I created a circular base for the bottom and filled in any gaps with clay and some more bacon bond. Now, as this bath is essentially going to be a resin bath, I sealed the inner edges with some UV resin just to make sure nothing escapes. Now, for those of you with at least one functioning eye, you might notice that the base here is different to the one that I made at the beginning. Well, it's because the scale was off, so I redid it off camera. Alright, sound good? Good. Now we're going to start putting together our boy. I started with a lump of alfoil just for a rough shape, before using a thick armature wire for the arms and then wrapping that with a thin wire. I find this helps the clay stick much better. So now we start the bulking. A base layer of clay helps round out the shape before we add all the other layers on top, which helps make up the main shape of this creature. Now that my base was all done, I primed it with white and used it to check the scale of my Noface. After this, it's mostly just lumps and blobs of clay blended in to round out the body. Once I deemed him thick enough, I thought it would be fun to swap over different masks by having them attached with magnets, but on account of sheer laziness, I never made a second mask, so the whole exercise became redundant. For texture, I wrapped him in little snakes to add to his blobbiness. I smoothed down the snakes with a scraping tool before refining the edges with another silicone smoother. In the scene that I'm recreating, Noface is essentially an amorphous pile of goo, but he's got these weedy, knobbly little arms. So here I am beefing up and defining the main muscle groups of the arms before blending it back into the main part of the body. Now to finish up his little limbs, I'm wrapping up with the hands. So I started out with some flattened pads of clay before cutting out some fingers. Hands, especially at this scale, can be incredibly frustrating to add details. For things like palm fat pads and knuckles, it's best to make sure that you've already pre-baked the hands. After the sculpting's all done, we're going to start the super complex process of painting, which is black. Just black. For the painting of the bath, I did a base coat of white before a second coat of black over the top, making sure to keep the interior of the tub white. My logic was that the water in the movie was a cool blue and a black interior would just make the resin look too murky. Keeping with movie accuracy, the bath almost looks like it's cast iron surrounded by concrete. To get the concrete effect, I mixed together some grey and some white paint with a little bit of plaster of Paris and some Mod Podge, and this gave it more of a gritty texture. Then I was able to dry brush the surface with a light grey. To make this build more interesting to look at, I'm going to make some serving tables and food. For this, I created a small template out of paper and cut out some flattened clay. After baking, I assembled all the parts to make some small, somewhat movie-accurate serving tables. I fixed all the parts together with bacon bond and smoothed out any gaps with clay. When it came to making the bowls of food, I used a pre-made, pre-cooked ball of clay and used this as a negative mold. I put some clay over the top, before using a cookie cutter to define the edges. After this, it was just using sandpaper to tidy up any edges and clear off all the rough spots. To touch more on the Nikocado law, we're going to make some toxic looking ramen. With an extruder, I squirted out some thin noodles and then twisted them in a way that was reminiscent of nuclear ramen. After an undercoat of white, the tables got a black and red paint job before a glossy varnish. The noodles got a pale yellow base colour before a heavily diluted wash of orange, blue and green. For some extra authenticity, I made some chopsticks from straightened armature wire with the edges sanded down. Finally, our bouncing baby boy Noface needs, weirdly enough, a face. Similar to anatomical sculpting, I lined up the face before poking some holes in the eyes and started carving out the mouth. To add further details to the face, a small ball of clay helps make up the nose as well as the chin, and a snake across the forehead helps make up the brow. Of course, when making the hair, be sure to include Nikocado's vampiric widow's peak. I squished in 2 small pre-baked eyes before building up the eyelids. After this, I defined the features around his mouth like his lips, before shaping up and making him some eyebrows. Now that we're almost done, let's fill up his bath before we call it a day. I mixed up some 2-part resin and dyed them with a blue alcohol ink as well as a little bit of white just for some extra opacity. I wasn't too fussed about bubbles getting mixed in with the resin. If anything, the small bubbles sort of added to the effect. After his dip in the resin bath, I added some texture to the top of the water with some UV resin. This gave it more of a moving water effect and helped make things look more dynamic. To finish off Noface's face, I gave him a quick paint job. I used a light beige for the skin tone, and I kept with black for the hair and black for the markings under the eyes and the chin, as well as a light purple for the markings above and below his eyes. And that concludes this build. Hope you guys enjoyed watching it as much as I enjoyed doing it. Cheers.